Hello. Okay, so before I begin, I just want to say Harrison's been working on this thesis for over a year now and is probably one of the most comprehensive papers I've ever read in my entire life. It's over 100 pages and he's been working so hard on it, and I hope that I can do at least half of the justice that this paper deserves and the conversation that we're going to begin with. American Rage, Populism, Past, Present, and Future. Let's begin by defining populism, or at least what it means in an American context. Populism is an expression of frustration, anger, or as the title of this talk suggests, rage at the institutions of society. These feelings come from a real or imagined perception of disenfranchisement. The people that feel this tend to be working class and are suffering economic hardship. They also often perceive a cultural shift away from core principles that they hold dear about their country and themselves. These basic characteristics tend to be common in all American populist movements. Now that we have a definition, we can begin. Some of the most recent examples of American populism are that of Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. These two men are on opposite sides of the political spectrum, and yet both have been considered populists, and not without reason. Both have spoken against the institutions of the United States. Both became very popular among groups of people who, in some cases, were almost fanatic in their support. Both never had majority support across the United States, and both have left their mark on the mainstream of American politics. These two men are populists, but in very different ways. Right-wing populism, as expressed by Trump, tends to set itself up against elites, whether that be economic, cultural, or academic. Left-wing populism often appeals to class consciousness and the oppression of working-class people. We will be spending this talk mostly on right-wing populism. Populism is not something new in the United States. In the 1890s, there was a convergence of various reform organizations that led to the creation of the People's Party. The two men you see here are some of the most influential members. On one side, we have John B. Rayner, one of the most influential black populists. He was centered in Texas, and the effect on gaining support among black farmers for the People's Party was considered great by populists then and historians now. Rayner was born into slavery, the son of an enslaved woman and the man who owned her. Tom Watson, on the other hand, he was a former Democratic politician from Georgia. He was, by his own admission, a white supremacist. While he did not make overtures to the black community to join in the struggle against the economic and political system he argued was oppressing them all. He never questioned the ideas of white supremacy or the institutions that upheld them. These two men existed within the same party, and that should show us clearly that populism is complicated. Now, what happened to the People's Party? Well, they formed around 1892, which was the year of a presidential election. Here's the map of the result. They won 4 states with a few electoral votes scattered around the rest of the country. They also got roughly 1 million votes. They were nowhere near winning the presidency, but keep in mind that they had only been campaigning for a few months, and 1 million voters in this election was roughly 1 out of 11 voters. This was a powerful movement, and for 4 years, they would struggle against the Democrats and Republicans for office. So what did the populists stand for? In general, here are a few examples of what they agreed on. These demands would largely not be met while the People's Party functioned. It would take roughly 20 to 30 years for the reforms to become law during the progressive era. The People's Party did not affect the mainstream American political culture. It just wasn't around to see its own influence. Let's go back and look at the 1896 presidential election map. What happened in 1896? Where's the People's Party on the map? Well, the People's Party, over many protests, had fused nationally with the Democrats. This meant that they nominated the same person as the Democrats did for the presidential candidate. And in the end, the People's Party had tied itself to a losing candidate, and it led to the party dispersing from the national political scene. Populism, as an independent political party, was gone. But the ideology wasn't, and its effect on the mainstream were not. Just as the populist demands of the 1890s would eventually be met and accepted into the mainstream, so are the ideas of populists like Bernie Sanders. When he challenged Hillary Clinton during the Democratic primaries, he was expressing ideas that Democrats didn't really express. Universal health care, free college, taxing the richest in America. His message spoke to people, And although he lost, we saw many candidates in the 2020 election being openly progressive. The populist message had affected and moved the mainstream within the Democratic Party. And what happened to these progressives? They all lost to a moderate. Biden, the moderate, won the nomination and the presidency. The mainstream was moved, especially among young people, but the Democratic Party leaned back from the populist message of those like Sanders and, to some extent, Elizabeth Warren and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The Republicans did something different. In 2016, a crowd full of establishment Republicans, they voted for Trump. Whereas populists in the past have affected the mainstream in the long run, Trump made himself the mainstream, and the Republican Party agreed. His populist rhetoric was anti-elite in all senses and spoke to the dissatisfaction that mostly more rural white people were feeling within the country. This part is important to discuss. Trump supporters are mostly white people that have been told their entire lives that within the American system, they are inherently better because of their skin color. While this is what they have been told, their lives in many cases have been hard. Poverty, losing jobs to automation, toxic masculinity, not being heard by the political system, and in general, people looking down upon the work that they do. All of these things affect the people who supported Trump. Instead of allying themselves with other oppressed groups to form coalitions and examine and change the structures of this country, they followed the man who gave an answer to their problems that aligned with the worldview that they had been taught. It wasn't that they were poor because they had failed, as we are often taught to believe, but because they had been cheated. So when it came down to it, where Democrats leaned back from populism, Republicans leaned in. The hardships that the people who supported Trump are real. The answers they came to and were presented with are in the end going to hurt not only themselves, but this entire country, especially people of color and all other marginalized groups. But we voted Trump out, so everything should be good. Look at the 2020 election map. Biden overwhelmingly won and did so in many of the states that voted for Trump in 2016, and also in traditionally Republican states. The moderates had won. The Republicans would move from far right to center right, and we could all happily wait as the Democrats slowly let their mainstream become more and more progressive. Everything was going to be fine. Well, if you've been paying attention to the news, you know that's not the case. The United States has elected a populist. Populists attack institutions, so they are dangerous to liberal democracies such as we live in. The press was attacked. Our election process was attacked. The very core of how our government works was attacked. It should have been no surprise that the January 6th insurrection happened. The groundwork had been being laid for years. Our institutions are attacked, and what we hold dear as a democratic country was called into question of legitimacy time and time again. And there isn't a stop to this type of populism. Whereas previously political parties reassess after such an election loss, the Republican Party is still leaning in. Look at these numbers. President Biden is not a well-liked man, and many people believe that he was not actually elected president. Populists get elected when people are angry, when institutions fail them or are being perceived as failing them. Moderates lose. Right-wing populism in the United States is still here. So we need a plan moving forward, something we can do to stop ourselves from being torn apart by right-wing populism. A plan so that January 6th insurrection-type event never happens again. Here are a few ideas. One, we have to shore up our institutions, the free press, our election process, our core democratic values. That's the first step. I would go a step further than that. I would say that many of the main problems that we are facing go back to the inherent unfairness within our systems of government and American life. Populism is rooted in this unfairness. We need to live up to the values that we so often espouse. Values of equality, equity, liberty, freedom, and justice. We need to rethink what our systems are and work to achieve these values. In doing so, we will make more truly representative institutions and will limit the extent to which right-wing populism can form. A second step is perhaps the most personal and the most difficult. It's something that people have been shouting from the rooftops for decades, and people have been ignoring for just as long. We need to confront our history in this country. We need to confront it, but not just that, understand it, process it, and work towards justice. We cannot view ourselves as a people, as an American people, if we cannot agree on the past. We will always be easily divided if we can't agree on this most basic thing. Populists often say that they speak for the people, but their view of the people is always limited. They always construct an other that the true people they claim to represent must stand against. The other can be anyone: Black people, Jewish people, women, Mexican immigrants, Chinese immigrants, Catholics. The list goes on. It can be anyone. It almost has been everyone. To not let populism divide us, we have to start seeing each other as people. When President Obama was an up-and-coming politician within the Democratic Party, he gave a speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention that put him on the political map. In that speech, he stated, "If there's a child on the south side of Chicago who can't read, that matters to me, even if it's not my child. If there's a senior citizen somewhere who can't pay for her prescription and has to choose between medicine and the rent, that makes my life poorer, and it's not my grandmother. If there's an Arab American family being rounded up without benefit of an attorney or due process, that threatens my civil liberties. It's that fundamental belief. I am my brother's keeper, I am my sister's keeper." Obama then finishes the sentence by saying, "That makes this country work." But we aren't working. We don't view each other as people who have lives, dreams, aspirations, struggles, and people who are suffering. It will be a difficult process. In a time we are becoming more and more politically divided, when some people are putting in their work to change and others digging in their heels, resisting with all their might, when it's uncommon to speak to people who don't agree with, we need to care about other people. If there's a poor farmer in Mississippi who has no prospects moving forward, we need to care. If there's a college student in a major city on the East Coast who can't afford their textbooks, we need to care. If there's a factory worker in Detroit who just lost their job and doesn't know where to look, we need to care. If there are Ukrainians suffering right now under a Russian invasion, we need to care. If there are swastikas drawn on a college campus in Norton, Massachusetts, and there are students who are scared, we need to care. The list goes on. It isn't ending, and now is not the time for apathy or cowardness. Now is the time to show up. And ask ourselves, as I ask you now, what are we going to do? Because the answer to that question is what will preserve this democracy. And I guarantee you that there isn't just one answer. The road ahead isn't easy, but it's one we must walk if we wish to still live in a democratic country. Democracy isn't the default setting of a society. It's difficult, needs constant attending to, and it is fragile. If it fails, we don't get a second chance. So we have to fight to preserve it, each and every one of us. Thank you.